Hey guys, so what we are doing this week is we are continuing on looking at theme development. So we've worked the past couple weeks with Paul Dunbar, who's a great poet, and we looked at his poems for mood and tone as well as theme development. So we're continuing looking at theme development, but we are using a short story this week by an amazing author named Eugenia Collier. We are going to be reading her short story, Marigolds. So students have the option to either read this on their own or you can walk through it with me as I read it to you. Okay, so let's kind of go through this and let's look at her story. This is a fantastic story. I love doing this with my students in the classroom. It's really good for teaching theme development with symbolism and setting. Okay, so kind of the overarching question that we have is, what if life had a reset button? And this is kind of, we'll see this kind of developed in the story of kids that necessarily do something, and then right after they do it, they're like, I don't really like what I did. I wish I could redo it. So let's look at this. So it's a terrible thing to drop your grandmother's prized china vase on the kitchen floor. And did you really have to be so mean to your little brother yesterday? At one point or one time or another, we've all done or said something that makes us cringe with regret. And we wish we could turn back the clock by a minute or a day or just do the whole thing over. And so this is something that we're going to see in this short story with some of the kids that are our main characters. So before I like to look at the text, I always like to get a little bit of background knowledge for my students so we kind of understand what's going on, okay? So let's first kind of look at the theme and the setting that we're going to see. Okay, so Marigolds takes place, let me see if I can highlight this for you. Okay, so it says Marigolds takes place in a rural African American community during, oh, that's not working very well. I won't use that. That's more distracting. Okay. Um, During a time of racial segregation, poverty, and limited opportunity, the setting offers important clues along or about the development in the story's theme or underlying message. For example, the figurative or the non literal description of futile waiting as the soulful background of music of our impoverished little community powerfully describes the setting and hints at the hopelessness of the narrator's situation. So, as you read the story, think about how the setting influences the narrator's experiences and the conflicts that she faces. What messages do these experiences teach us about life? So, that's something that I kind of want you guys to be thinking about as we're going through this text, okay? So, first, let's look at our author. So, Eugenia Collier is a fantastic writer. She was born in 1928. All right. So she grew up in a segregated part of Baltimore, Maryland. So if you're looking at the time period, remember something that you're always looking at when you're looking at a text is when was it written? And that's going to give us a lot of background knowledge that we need in order to understand the subject a little bit better. Okay. So she was raised in segregated Baltimore, Maryland, where the city where she still actually lives today. She's still alive. Okay. From her parents, they were a doctor and a teacher. Collier learned the value of education at a very young age. This led her to graduate with high honors from Howard University, which is a great school. And then she received a Master's of Arts from Columbia University, which is another really good school as well. All right, after working for 5 years as a caseworker for the Baltimore Department of Public Welfare, Collier became a college professor and started her writing career. She credits her African American heritage as her inspiration. The fact of my Blackness is at the core and the center of my creativity. Marigolds is one of her first stories, won the Gwendolyn Brooks Award for the fiction in 1969. Since then, her stories and poems and essays have appeared in many anthologies and magazines, and she was selected as an outstanding educator in 1972 through 1975. And she won a Distinguished Writers Award. So she is very successful as a writer, which is another awesome reason to study her. So let's look a little bit at the background of the story, because remember, like I said, look at when it's written and look at the time period and the setting in the story, okay? So the time of the story is set in the 1930s. Okay, so during the Great Depression of the 1930s, millions of Americans suffered from unemployment. Government programs such as the unemployment insurance that was available today didn't necessarily exist yet. And so a lot of people did not get the help they needed during these tough times. Although many Americans suffered, African Americans were particularly hit extremely hard. In the age of racial segregation and prejudice, Black people generally had fewer job opportunities and higher unemployment rates. And so this is something that is bleeding into her work that we're going to see in Marigolds. Okay, so let's kind of walk through this text together. All right, so follow along as I read. So, Marigolds by Eugenia Collier. When I think of the hometown of my youth, all that I seem to remember is dust, the brown, crumbly dust of late summer, arid, sterile dust that gets into the eyes and makes them water, gets into the throat and between the toes of bare brown feet. I don't know why I should remember only the dust. Surely there must be lush green lawns and paved streets under leafy shade trees somewhere in town. But memory is an abstract painting. It does not present as they are, but rather as they feel. And so, when I think of the time and that place, I remember only the dry September of the dirt roads and the grassless yards of the shanty town where I lived. And the other thing I remember, another incongruency of memory, a brilliant splash of sunny yellow against the dust. Miss Lottie's Marigolds. Okay, so right here, she is really painting the picture of the type of town that she grew up in. Okay, she doesn't remember it as a very beautiful place. It's not like this beautiful suburb with white picket fence. It's kind of a dusty town, and there's not a lot of going on. There's not a lot of richness to it. Okay, but then we have this contrast here where she's talking about Miss Lottie's Marigolds. And we obviously know those are important because that is the title of the story. Okay. She continues, she says, whenever the memory of those marigolds flash across my mind, a strange nostalgia comes with it and remains long after the picture has faded. I feel again the chaotic emotions of adolescence, elusive as smoke, yet as real as the potted geranium before me now. Joy and rage and wild animal gladness and shame become tangled together in the multicolored skein of 14 going on 15, as I recall, that devastating moment when I suddenly, more woman than child years ago in Miss Lottie's yard. I think of those marigolds at the strangest times. I remember them vividly now, and I desperately pass away the time waiting for you who will not come. Okay, so this paragraph, there's a lot going on in this paragraph. So she is really kind of foreshadowing that whatever happened with these flowers, with these marigolds, have kind of continued to haunt her into adulthood. Okay, so this is a really good technique that she's using to kind of get the reader, get us asking, what's up with these marigolds, right? Why are these flowers? Why did they have such a lasting impact on you? How could flowers do that? Okay. So she says, I suppose the futile, which anytime you see an underlined word, make sure to always look at the footnotes. Okay, so futile is just having no useful result. I suppose that futile waiting was the sorrowful background music of our impoverished little community when I was young. It's a powerful sentence right there. The Depression, which we know is the Great Depression, that gripped the nation was no new thing for us. For the Black workers of rural Maryland had always been depressed. And by depressed, they're talking about economically, okay? I don't know what it was that we were waiting for. Certainly not for the prosperity that was just around the corner, for those were white folks' words, which we never believed. Nor did we wait for hard work and thrift to pay off in shining success as the American dream promised, for we knew better than that too. Perhaps we waited for a miracle. All right, let's go to the next page. So again, these marigolds are popping up, so we know it's pretty important. They have a big symbolic meaning for us that we'll figure out. Amorphous in concept, but necessary if one were to have the grit to rise before dawn each day and labor in the white man's vineyard until after dark. or to wander about in September dust, offering one's sweat in return for some meager share of bread. But God was chary with miracles in those days. And so we waited and we waited. We children, of course, were only vaguely aware of the extent of our poverty. Having no radios, few newspapers, no magazines, we were somewhat unaware of the world outside our community. Nowadays, we would be called culturally deprived, and people would write books and hold conferences about us. In those days, everybody we knew was just as hungry and ill clad as we were. Poverty was the cage in which we were all trapped, and our hatred of it was that still vague, undirected restlessness of the zoo bred flamingo who knows that nature created him to fly free. So think about how much that relates to the Maya Angelou poem that we've been reading, this idea of your circumstances trapping you. Remember Sympathy by Paul Dunbar, we read this poem. It can tie perfectly in here with this same symbolic imagery right here where it says, poverty was the cage in which we were all trapped. Okay, we talked about how Dunbar was kind of creating that poem to talk about how the American dream was developed in stanza 1, and he was trapped in this bloody cage and he can't get out. And this is something that Collier is also talking about, this idea of not being able to escape the circumstances that you have been naturally born into, right? It's not because they did anything, it's just something that was given to them by birth. Their skin color, their social economic status, these are things that you cannot change at all. Okay. All right. And so as I think of those days, I think most poignantly the tag end of summer, the bright, dry times when we began to have the sense of shortening days and the immense of cold. So kind of think about that too. Think about if they're very poor, winter probably looks a lot different for them, especially in Maryland. Okay, it's not like Tennessee winters. In Maryland, it gets definitely a lot colder. Okay, and if you don't have a lot of money, that cold is going to feel a little bit different than if you do have heat in the house. All right, by the time I was 14, my brother Joey and I were the only children left at our house. The older ones had left home for early marriage or the lure of the city, and the two babies having been sent to relatives who might care for them better than we. Joey was 3 years younger than I, and a boy, and therefore vastly inferior. All right. Each morning, our mother and father trudged wearingly down the dirt road and around the bend, she to her domestic job, he to his daily unsuccessful quest for work. After our few chores around the tumble down shanty, which is a type of like a shack or a house, Joey and I were free to run wild in the sun with other children similarly situated. For the most part, those days were ill defined in my memory, running together and combining like a fresh watercolor painting left out in the rain. So think about how beautiful this simile is that she is developing here, comparing it to her memory. So she's like, I don't really remember my childhood much, and she kind of gives us the image of watercolors that's been out left in the rain, which is a great image for when everything kind of runs together, and it's like I kind of remember a little bit, but they're all kind of mushed. Okay, I don't necessarily remember, Tuesday, January 15th when I was a 5. Okay, it's all kind of blended together. So she says, I remember squatting in the road, drawing a picture in the dust. A picture that Joey gleefully erased with one sweep of his dirty foot. I remember fishing for minnows in a muddy creek and watching sadly as they eluded my cupped hands, while Joey laughed uproariously. And I remember that year a strange restlessness of body and of spirit, a feeling that something old and familiar was ending, and something unknown and therefore terrifying was beginning. All right, so think about what changes are kind of happening in her life. How old is she here? Well, she's 14. Okay, so that's kind of like when you're leaving childhood behind and you're kind of starting to learn to be an adult. And so a lot of you guys as freshmen are 14 as well, so you can kind of relate to that feeling. So she continues, she says, one day returns to me with special clarity for some reason, perhaps because it was the beginning of the experience that in some inexplicable way marked the end of innocence. Okay, so she is talking about leaving childhood behind. I was loafing under a great oak tree in our yard, deep in some reverie, which I had now forgotten, except that it involved some secret thoughts of one of the Harris's boys across the yard. Joey and a bunch of kids were bored now with the old tires suspended from an oak limb, which had kept them entertained for a while. Hey, Elizabeth, Joey yelled. He never talked. He never talked when he could yell. Hey, Elizabeth, let us go somewhere. I came reluctantly out of my private world. Where do you want to go? What do you want to do? The truth was that we were becoming tired of the formlessness of our summer days. And so this is a powerful phrase right here. Okay. So it's the idea that kids like routine, right? And she's like, I mean, it sounds great at first. You kind of, kind of get to sit at home. And a lot of us kind of experienced this, everything that happened with COVID-19, right? We're like, oh, we're gonna stay home. But then it's like, oh, we're staying home. Okay. And so this is something that we as a reader can relate to, right? The formlessness of our time spent at home, and the lack of routine. The idleness whose prospect had seemed so beautiful during the busy days of spring now had degenerated to an almost desperate effort to fill up the empty midday hours. Let's go see. Can we find some locusts on the hill? Someone suggested. Joey was scornful. Ain't no more locusts there. Y'all got 'em all while they are still green. The argument that followed was brief and not really worth the effort. Hunting locust trees wasn't fun anymore by now. Tell you what, said Joey finally, his eyes sparkling. Let's go to Miss Lottie's. The idea caught on at once, for annoying Miss Lottie was always fun. I was still child enough to scamper along with the group over rickety fences and through bushes that tore our already raggedy clothes back to where Miss Lottie lived. I think now that we must have had a tragic comic spectacle. 5 or 6 kids of different ages, each of us clad in only one garment. The girls in faded dresses that were too long or too short, and the boys in patchy pants, their sweaty brown chests gleaming in the hot sun. A little cloud of dust followed our thin legs and bare feet as we tramped over the barren land. Let me turn my classroom light back on right quick. Okay, sorry. It's motion activated. All right, so they're going to Miss Lottie's house, and we now know that they are not going over there to be sweet, right? They said, and we know that by her word choice. She says, annoying Miss Lottie was always fun. Okay, so it doesn't seem like these kids are up to anything positive. So looking at line 91, she says, when Miss Lottie's house came into view, we stopped ostensibly to plan our strategy, but actually to reinforce our courage. Okay, so maybe Miss Lottie is somebody to be afraid of. Miss Lottie's house was the most ramshackle of all of the ramshackle homes. The sun and the rain had long since faded its rickety frame, siding from white to a sullen gray. The boards themselves seemed to remain upright, not from being nailed together, but rather from leaning together like a house that a child might have constructed from cards. A brisk wind might have blown it down, and the fact that it was still standing implied a kind of enchantment that was stronger than the elements. Okay, so there's kind of this weird aura going on with Miss Lottie's house. Okay, kind of like this weird, spooky, enchanted place almost. But Miss Lottie is not somebody that the kids are very welcomed by, and we kind of see this when she said they had to reinforce their courage to even go by her house. There it stood, and as far as I know, still standing yet, a gray, rotting thing with no porch, no shutters, no steps, set on a cramped lot with no grass, not even any weeds. A monument to decay. Very powerful language there. Okay. So let's think about, what does this say about her social standing in the community? Well, it tells us that financially, Miss Lottie doesn't have a lot of money either, so she kind of fits in social economically with the kids, right? She doesn't have a lot of things, because we can kind of see that through the way that her house is described. Okay. In front of the house, in a squeaking rocking chair, sat Miss Lottie's son, John Burke, completing the impression of decay. Okay, so right there we kind of know that John Burke doesn't necessarily look like he's in the tip-top shape either. Okay, he kind of matches the atmosphere of the house. John Burke was what was known as queer-headed, Black and ageless, he sat, rocking day in and day out in a mindless stupor, lulled by the monotonous squeak squawk of the chair. A battered hat atop his shaggy head shaded him from the sun. Usually, John Burke was totally unaware of everything outside his quiet dream world. But if you disturbed him, if you intruded upon his fantasies, he would become enraged, strike out at you, and curse at you in some strange, enchanted language which only he could understand. We children made a game of thinking of ways to disturb John Burke and then to elude his violent retribution, right, or his way to get back at the kids. Okay, and so kind of this Miss Lottie's son, even like she said, kind of matches the house. You know, it looks like he may have some type of developmental delay, or he's not really all there, and he doesn't really know what's going on around him, and he kind of just sits on the porch all day, kind of in his own little world, right? All right, but now they say, but our real fun and our real fear lay in Miss Lottie herself. Miss Lottie seemed to be at least 100 years old. Her big frame still held traces of tall, powerful woman she must have been in her youth, although it was now bent and drawn. Her smooth skin was a dark reddish brown, and her face had Indian like features and stern stoicism that one associates with Indian faces. Miss Lottie didn't like intruders either, especially children. She never left her yard, and nobody ever visited her. They never knew how she managed those necessities that depended on human interaction, like how she ate, for example, or whether she ate. When we were tiny children, we thought Miss Lottie was a witch, and we made up tales that we have believed ourselves about her exploits. We were too far sophisticated now, of course, to believe that witch nonsense. But old fears have a way of clinging like cobwebs. And so when we sighted the tumble down shack, we had to stop to reinforce our nerves. So let's talk really quickly about indirect characterization. So this is something we talked about with how an author can develop a character. So here we see Miss Lottie is being developed how? Remember, there's 5 ways. We have speech, thoughts, effects, actions, looks. How is Miss Lottie being developed here? It's kind of in 2 ways, right? We have her looks for sure, all right here. This is all evidence of what she physically looks like and how she kind of depends on the children. And then the last half is her effect on other people, talking about how no one goes near her, and how people thought that she was a witch, and so they kind of stay away from her. So how Collier is developing her is through her looks and through her effect. Okay. Look, there she is, I whispered, forgetting that Miss Lottie could not possibly have heard me from that distance. She's fooling with them crazy flowers. Yeah, look at her. So Lottie's marigolds. So here's the flowers that we've kind of been waiting for, right? They've had a lot of foreshadowing up to what these flowers can mean. Were perhaps the strangest part of the picture. Certainly, they did not fit in with the crumbling decay of the rest of her yard. Beyond the dusty brown yard in the front of the sorry green house rose suddenly and shockingly a dazzling strip of bright blossoms clumped together in enormous mounds, warm, passionate, and sun golden. The old black witch woman worked on them all summer, every summer, down on her creaky knees, weeding and cultivating and arranging, while the house crumbled and John Burke rocked. For some perverse reason, we children hated those marigolds. They interfered with the perfect ugliness of the place. They were too beautiful. They said too much that we could not understand. They did not make sense. There was something in the vigor with which the old woman destroyed the weeds that intimidated us. It should have been a comical sight, the old woman with the man's hat on her cropped white head leaning over the bright mounds with her backside in the air. But it wasn't comical. It wasn't something we could name. We had to annoy her by whizzing a pebble into her flowers or by yelling a dirty word and then dancing away from her rage, reveling in our youth and mocking her age. Actually, I think it was the flowers we wanted to destroy, but nobody had the nerve to try it, not even Joey, who was usually fool enough to try anything. So it's very interesting. These flowers are not necessarily a positive things for these kids, and it's kind of developed here, and this is our direct evidence to prove that for some perverse reason or harmful wrong reason, the children hated the marigolds. They didn't fit. They're like, all of our town is ugly. We don't have any money. Everything's kind of run down and dusty and gross. And then there's these flowers, all right? And kids hate things that they can't understand. And so they're like, why does this old woman who has nothing going for her have these beautiful flowers? I don't like it. So let's figure it out. Y'all get some stones, commanded Joey now, and was met with instant giggling obedience as everyone except me began to gather pebbles from the dusty ground. Come on, Elizabeth. I just stood there peering through the bushes, torn between wanting to join the fun and feeling that it was all a little bit silly. You scared, Elizabeth? I cursed and spat on the ground, my favorite gesture of phony bravado. Y'all children get the stones. I'll show you how to use them. All right, so she's kind of starting to get a little bit of peer pressure here, and she's going to kind of see what the kids are wanting to do with these stones. All right, and here's a good picture illustrated of what Miss Lottie could look like. I said before that we children were not consciously aware of how thick were the bars of our cage. We'll come back to that. I wonder now, though, whether we were not more aware of it than I thought. Perhaps we had some dim notion of what we were and how little chance we had to be anything else. Otherwise, why would we have been so preoccupied with destruction? Anyway, the pebbles were collected quickly, and everybody looked at me to begin the fun. So this is a very, very big part here that's developed in the story. Okay, so she's saying she's going back to these bars. That she's kind of personified almost as being her cage, right? And she's saying, I think we got it. I think when we were little, we were kind of a little bit naive to our circumstances and the fact that we are African American. We're living in the Great Depression. We're living in a segregated America. We've got all of these blocks kind of stacked against us. And it was easy for us to kind of be like, oh, we're kids. We don't know what's going on. But she's saying, I think we did know what was going on, and I think we had a lot of anger towards that, right? Like anyone would. I mean, the cards were really stacked against them, and they were born into it, right? It was nothing that they did in order to make those circumstances for themselves. And so, like anyone, they would have a lot of anger, and that's something that we talked about with Dunbar's poems. So she says, come on, y'all. We crept to the edge of the bushes that bordered the narrow road in front of Miss Lottie's place. She was working placidly, kneeling over the flowers, and her dark hand plunged into the golden mounds. Suddenly, zing! An appropriately aimed stone cut the head off one of her blossoms. Who out there? Miss Lottie's backside came down, and her head came up as sharp as her eyes searched the bushes. You better get! We had crouched down out of sight in the bushes, where we stifled the giggles that insisted on coming. Miss Lottie gazed wearily across the road for a moment, then cautiously returned to her weeding. Zing! Zoe sent a pebble into the blooms. Another marigold was beheaded. Miss Lottie was enraged now. She began struggling to her feet, leaning on a rickety cane and shouting, y'all get, go on home. Then the rest of the kids let loose their pebbles, storming the flowers, laughing wildly and senselessly at Miss Lottie's impotent rage. She shook her stick at us and started shakingly towards the road, crying, get along! John Burke, come help! Then I lost my head entirely. Mad with the power of inciting such rage, I ran out of the bushes in the storm of the pebbles, straight towards Miss Lottie's, chanting madly, old witch fell in the ditch, picked up a penny, and thought she was rich. The children screamed with the lights, dropped their pebbles, and joined the crazy dance, swarming around Miss Lottie like bees and chanting, old lady witch, while she screamed curses at us. The madness lasted only a moment, for John Burke, startled at last, lurched out of his chair and we dashed for the bushes just as Miss Lottie's cane went whizzing at my head. I did not join the merriment when the kids gathered again under the oak in our bare yard. Suddenly, I was ashamed, and I did not like being ashamed. The child in me sulked. Instead, it was all in fun. But the woman in me flinched at the thought of the malicious attack that I had led. So she's kind of having this weird, was that the right thing to do, right? And that's something that we do naturally as we kind of get older. The mood lasted all afternoon. And when we ate the beans and rice, that was supper that night, I did not notice my father's silence, for he was always silent these days. Nor did I notice my mother's absence, for she always worked until well into the evening. Joey and I had particularly bitter argument after supper. His exuberance got on my nerves. Finally, I stretched out upon the pallet in the room that we shared and fell into a fitful doze. When I awoke, somewhere in the middle of the night, my mother had returned. I had vaguely listened to the conversation that was audible through the thin walls that separated our rooms. At first, I heard no words, only voices. My mother's voice was like a cool, dark room in summer. It's beautiful, isn't it? Beautiful writing. Peaceful, soothing, quiet. I love to listen to it. I made things seem all right somehow. My father's voice cut through hers, shattering the peace. 22 years, Maybelle. 22 years, he was saying, and I got nothing for you. Nothing, nothing. It's all right, honey. You'll get something. Everybody's out of work now. You know that. It ain't right. Ain't no man ought to eat his woman's food year in and year out and see his children running wild. Ain't nothing right about that. Honey, you took good care of us when you had it. Ain't nobody got nothing nowadays. I ain't talking about nobody else. I'm talking about me. God knows I try. My mother said something I couldn't hear, and my father cried out louder. What's must a man to do? Tell me that. All right. So what is the family arguing about? Well, they're talking about the fact that the dad kind of feels like he doesn't have anything to provide for his family, which is a hard thing for a father to feel, especially during this time period. And his wife is trying to lovingly support him, be like, babe, it's okay. Like we can do this together. Now, think about this. That's a very adult conversation that Elizabeth is having to listen to her parents have. Okay, that's not something that a kid should be involved with. And so that's a lot of weight that's pressing down not only on the parents' shoulders, but now on Elizabeth's shoulders. So the mom says, look, we ain't starving. I get paid every week, and Miss Ellis is real nice about giving me things. She gonna let me have Mr. Ellis's old coat for you this winter. Damn Miss Ellis's coat. And damn his money. You think I want white folks leavings? Damn, Maybelle. And suddenly he sobbed, loudly and painfully, and cried helplessly and hopelessly in the dark night. I had never heard a man cry before. I did not know men ever cried. I covered my ears with my hands and could not cut off the sound of my father's harsh, painful, despairing sobs. My father was a strong man who would whisk any child upon his shoulders and go singing through the house. My father whittled toys for us and laughed so loud that the great oaks seemed to laugh with him, and taught us to fish and hunt rabbits. How could it be that my father was crying? But the sobs went on, unstifled, finally quieting until I could hear my mother's voice, deep and rich, unstifled, finally quieting until I could hear my mother's, humming softly as she used to hum to a frightened child. The world had lost its boundary lines. My mother, who was small and soft, was now the strength of the family. My father, who was the rock on which the family had been built, was sobbing like the tiniest child. Everything was suddenly out of tune, like a broken accordion. Where did I fit into this crazy picture? I do not remember my thoughts, only the great feeling of bewilderment and fear. Long after the sobbing and the humming had stopped, I laid on the pallet, still as stone with my hands over my ears, wishing that I too could cry and be comforted. The night was silent now, except for the sounds of crickets and of Joey's soft breathing, but the room was too crowded with fear to allow me to sleep, and finally, feeling the terrible aloneness of 4 a.m., I decided to awaken Joey. Ouch! What's the matter with you? What do you want? He demanded, disagreeingly when I had pinched and slapped him awake. Come on, wake up! What for? Go away! I was lost for an unreasonable reply. I could not say I'm scared and I don't want to be alone, so I merely said I'm going out, and if you want to come, come on. The promised adventure awoke him. Going out now? Where to, Elizabeth? What are you going to do? I was pulling my dress over my head. Until now, I had not thought of going out. Just come on, I replied terselessly. I was out of the window and halfway down the road, therefore Joey caught up with me. All right, so this is kind of what we can kind of picture that she would be like. Wait, Elizabeth, where are you going? I was running as if the Furies were after me, as perhaps they were, running silently and ferociously until I came to where I had half known where I was headed, to Miss Lottie's yard. The half-dawn light was more eerie than complete darkness, and in it the old house was like the ruin that my world had become, foul and crumbling, a grotesque caricature. It looked haunted, and I was not afraid because I was haunted too. All right, so we have to think, what is she haunted? She's haunted about the pressure that is on her shoulders that is coming from her family and kind of her situation. Elizabeth, have you lost your mind? Panted Joey. I have indeed lost my mind. For all the smoldering emotions of that summer swelled in me and burst. The great need for my mother, who was never there, the hopelessness of poverty and degradation, the bewilderment of being neither child nor woman, or yet both at once, the fear unleashed by my father's tears, and these feelings combined in one great impulse in towards destruction. Lisbeth! I leaped furiously into the mounds of the marigolds and pulled madly, trampling and pulling and destroying the perfectly yellow blooms. The fresh smell of the morning and of dew-soaked marigolds spurred me on as as I went tearing and mingling and sobbing until Joey tugged my dress or my waist, crying, Elizabeth, stop! Please stop! And then I was sitting in the ruined little garden among the uprooted and ruined flowers, crying and crying. And it was too late to undo what I had done. Joy was sitting beside me, silent and frightened, not knowing what to say. Then, Elizabeth, look. I opened my swollen eyes and saw in front of me a pair of large, calloused feet. My gaze lifted up the swollen legs, an aged, distorted body clad in a tight cotton nightdress, and then the shadowed Indian face surrounded by stubby white hair. And there was no rage in the face now that the garden was destroyed. There was nothing any longer to be protected. Miss Lottie! I scrambled to my feet and just stood there and stared at her. And that was the moment when childhood faded and womanhood began. That violent, crazy act was the last act of childhood. For I gazed at the immobile face with the sad, weary eyes. I gazed upon a kind of reality that was hidden to childhood. The witch was no longer a witch, but only a broken old woman who had dared to create beauty in the midst of ugliness and sterility. And there she had been born in squalor and lived in it her whole life. And now at the end of that life, she had nothing except a fallen down hut, a wrecked body, John Burke, the mindless son of her passion. Whatever verve that was left in her, whatever was of love and of beauty and of joy that had not been squeezed out by life, had been there in the marigolds that she had so tenderly cared for. Of course, I could not express the things that I knew about Miss Lottie as I stood there awkward and ashamed. The years had put words to the things I knew in that moment. And as I looked back upon it, I know that that moment marked the end of innocence. People think of the loss of innocence as meaning the loss of virginity, and this is far from true. All right, innocence involves an unseeing acceptance of things at face value and ignorance of the area below the surface. In the humiliating moment that I looked beyond myself and into the depths of another person, there was the beginning of compassion, and one can't have both compassion and innocence. Right, it's a very deep, powerful phrase there. The years had taken me worlds away from that time and that place, and from the dust and the squalor of our lives, and from the bright thing that I destroyed, and the blind, childish striking out at God knows what. Miss Lottie died long ago, and many years had passed since I last saw her hut, completely barren at last, for despite my wild contrition, she never planted marigolds again. Yet, there are times when the image of those passionate yellow mounds return with painful poignancy. For one does not have to be ignorant and poor to find that one's life is barren in the dusty yards of one town. I too have planted marigolds. So, very, very powerful story here. We'll talk about it more in our synchronous class. But at the end of this, I want you to think about that last phrase. What does it mean to plant marigolds, right? Um, and what does Eugenia Collar mean? We obviously know that this is a story that lasted and that was very impactful for her. But think about, what does it mean to plant marigolds? What's the symbolism that Eugenia Collar is trying to paint out of this story that Elizabeth experienced with Miss Lottie, having these beautiful flowers in this midst of all of this pain and sorrow that she was born into as well, and then they're destroyed. Okay, so kind of be thinking about that, and then we will talk about it at our synchronous session. All right, guys, I hope this was helpful, and I will link this PDF for you that you can look back at it to reference. All right, bye, guys.